The email arrived at 8:15 a.m., just as the first sip of life-giving coffee was passing my lips. It had the subject line I'd come to both dread and mock. Friendly reminder from the Whispering Pines HOA. My name is Alex Thompson, and I live in a battlefield disguised as a suburb. The email, sent from the personal account of our glorious leader, Karen Swanson, informed me that I was being fined $25. My crime? My garden hose, a 50-foot serpent of green rubber, was visibly coiled in a counterclockwise direction. This, apparently, was a flagrant violation of Bylaw 112. C, a subclause in the Aesthetic Harmony and Outdoor Implements section of our community's sacred texts. The bylaw, which I was sure Karen had authored herself during a fever dream of beige-tinted rage, specified that all hoses must be coiled clockwise to maintain visual consistency and flow. I took another sip of coffee, the bitterness of the brew, a perfect match for the bitterness in my soul. I loved my little house. I loved the quiet street, the decent-sized backyard, and the fact that it was just far enough from the city to feel like a retreat. What I hated, with the passion of 1,000 suns, was the tyrannical regime that governed it. Whispering Pines. The name itself was a lie. There were no pines, only meticulously spaced sycamores that were not allowed to grow above a certain height. And there was no whispering. There was only the sound of lawnmowers set to a board-approved decibel level and the shrill, omnipresent voice of Karen Swanson enforcing her will upon us all. This was the woman who had presided over the Great Wind Chime War of 23, an incident that ended with her standing on my lawn with a sound level meter, declaring my bamboo chimes a public nuisance because they exceeded 40 decibels during a moderate breeze. This was the woman who had issued me a formal, written warning because my welcome mat, which read, "Welcome-ish," was deemed passive-aggressive and likely to lower the collective morale of the neighborhood. This was a woman who, I'm convinced, saw a blade of grass growing a millimeter taller than its neighbors and considered it a personal affront, an act of rebellion that must be crushed. I was contemplating the most sarcastic possible reply to her email when a different kind of warning cut through the morning stillness. A hazy, brownish-orange smudge on the horizon, one I'd been subconsciously tracking for the past 2 days, had grown darker. The air, already thick with the oppressive heat of a Southern California September, now carried the distinct, campfire-on-steroids scent of a wildfire getting too big for its britches. I turned on the TV. A news anchor with overly serious hair was standing in front of a map covered in angry red splotches. "The Canyon Fire has officially jumped the 101 freeway," he said grimly. "High winds and dry conditions are creating a worst-case scenario. A mandatory evacuation order has just been issued for the communities of Oak Ridge, Canyon Creek, and Whispering Pines." I sighed. Not a sigh of panic, but of pure, unadulterated weariness. This was the 3rd time in 5 years. You get used to it in a weird way. You develop a routine. First, the go box. A plastic tub containing birth certificates, passports, insurance documents, and a few sentimental photos. Check. Next, the tech. My work laptop. 3 external hard drives containing the sum total of my freelance web development career and all the requisite chargers. Check. Then, the most difficult part of the entire operation, corralling my cat. Chairman Meow, a fluffy Persian with the disposition of a deposed dictator, was already under the bed, hissing at the injustice of it all. After a 10-minute battle that involved a broom handle and a treaty negotiated with salmon-flavored treats, he was safely and angrily ensconced in his carrier. As I loaded my car, tossing in a case of water and a single, cherished bottle of 12-year-old scotch for medicinal purposes, I saw it. The big white county evacuation bus, lumbering to a stop in front of the community clubhouse. It was the designated collection point for residents who couldn't drive themselves. A group that consisted mostly of the neighborhood's senior citizens. A small cluster of them, including the impossibly sweet Mrs. Gable from 2 doors down, were already waiting patiently on the curb, their little overnight bags at their feet. Then, I saw her. Karen Swanson's silver sedan didn't so much drive as it glided, coming to a perfect, silent stop directly behind the bus. She emerged not with a suitcase, but with her ever-present clipboard and a look of thunderous rage on her face. I paused, my car keys dangling from my hand, a morbid curiosity taking hold. I figured she was about to write up the bus driver for idling on the decorative paving stones that flanked the clubhouse entrance, a known HOA capital offense. I was wrong. So So wrong. She didn't stop at the driver's window. She marched, with the righteous purpose of a zealot, straight to the front tire of the bus. For a moment, I thought she was going to inspect it for unapproved treadwear. Then she reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a brand new, silver box cutter. The world seemed to slow down. The faint roar of the distant fire, the chirping of birds, the hum of the bus's engine, it all faded into a dull background thrum. With a grunt of furious effort, Karen dropped to one knee and plunged the blade into the thick rubber of the tire's sidewall. Hiss. The sound was shockingly loud, violent. It was the sound of order collapsing into chaos. But she wasn't done. She scrambled to her feet, her face flushed with victory, and moved to the next tire. And the next. One by one, she stabbed each of the bus's 4 tires, leaving them to bleed their precious air onto the hot asphalt. The bus driver, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache, stumbled out of the bus, his jaw slack with disbelief. "Lady, what in God's name are you doing?" Karen stood up straight, brushing dust from her beige capri pants. She brandished her clipboard like a scepter. "This is a commercial vehicle exceeding 2 axles!" she shrieked, her voice a clarion call of insanity. "It is parked in a designated community amenity zone, a clear violation of Article 9, Section 4 of the Whispering Pines Covenants. I am making a citizen's arrest of this bus." Mrs. Gable, looking small and confused, took a shaky step forward. "But how will we get out, dear?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The fire." Before Karen could answer, a new sound began to permeate the air. It started as a low rumble, a vibration I felt more in my teeth than in my ears. It grew rapidly, morphing into a deep guttural roar that shook the very ground. It wasn't the fire, it was something else. Down the main boulevard of Whispering Pines they came. 2 of them. Massive, olive-drab, 8-wheeled behemoths, thundering down the street like angry rhinos. The words National Guard were stenciled in white on their sides. They chewed up the pristine asphalt Karen held so dear, their heavy treads leaving marks like scars. They were followed by 2 military-grade Humvees, which screeched to a halt behind them. The lead armored personnel carrier, or APC, hissed to a stop, its turret looming over Karen's prize-winning Petunia bed. The rear hatch dropped with a hydraulic sigh, and a man in camouflage fatigues stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern face and Master Sergeant chevrons on his collar. He took in the scene before him, the crippled bus, the terrified seniors, and one middle-aged woman standing proudly over 4 flat tires with a box cutter still clutched in her hand. His face cycled through a series of emotions, professional urgency, confusion, and finally, a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. I leaned against my car, took a long pull from the water bottle I'd filled with scotch, and muttered to the furious cat in his carrier. "Well, Chairman," I said, "this has officially escalated." The Master Sergeant, whose name tag read Miller, strode forward with the kind of ground-eating pace that suggested he had 0 time for nonsense. His boots crunched on the violated asphalt, each step a tiny gunshot in the sudden, tense silence. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low growl that could command legions. "I'm Master Sergeant Miller with the Army National Guard. There's a mandatory evacuation in effect. What in the ever-loving hell is going on here?" Karen, to her credit, didn't so much as flinch. Being faced with a man who looked like he ate nails for breakfast and was backed by 20 tons of armored steel did nothing to dent her cast-iron certainty. She held up her clipboard as if it were a holy shield. "Sergeant," she said, her tone condescendingly formal, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm, your vehicles are currently in violation of multiple community bylaws. Bylaw 43, F clearly states that the maximum gross vehicle weight permitted on this decorative pavement is 5 tons. Your tank." She gestured dismissively at the APC is also leaking oil onto my hybrid fescue grass. "Stayed." Miller stopped. He physically stopped walking and stared at her. He looked at the APC, then back at her. "Ma'am," he said, forcing the words through gritted teeth. "That is a Stryker armored personnel carrier. It is not leaking oil, it is sweating freedom. And in case you missed the giant pillar of smoke that is currently turning our sun into a dim orange penny, there is a 10,000-acre, wind-driven wildfire approximately 2 miles from where you are standing. We need to go. Now." "The bylaws are the bedrock of a stable community," Karen retorted, completely unmoved. Emergencies are not an excuse for anarchy. I will need to see your permit for operating heavy machinery within a residential zone, and I'll be citing you for the pavement damage." Miller looked like his brain had just blue-screened. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He ran a hand over his short-cropped hair, searching for a response that didn't involve treason. His eyes scanned the small crowd of bewildered onlookers and landed on me. I was the youngest, the one who didn't look like I was about to have a heart attack, and the one who was very obviously trying to sink into the side of my Toyota Camry. "You!" he barked, pointing a finger that could probably knock a man down. "Blonde hair, gray shirt, did you see what happened here?" I felt a dozen pairs of eyes turn to me. So much for a quiet, anonymous evacuation. I sighed, pushed myself off my car, and walked forward into the circle of insanity. "Yeah, I saw it," I said. She took issue with the bus's parking credentials and performed an aggressive, unscheduled deflation." Just then, a blessedly familiar sight appeared. A local police cruiser, moving at a speed that suggested a distinct lack of urgency, rolled up to the scene. The officer who got out was young, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too much caffeine and too many stupid calls. Officer Daniels. He'd been the one to mediate the Great Wind Chime War. He took in the scene. The APCs, the master sergeant who looked ready to invade a small country, the flat-tired bus, and Karen. His shoulders slumped in a gesture of profound spiritual exhaustion. He didn't even bother with formalities. He just looked at me and said, "Don't even tell me, let me guess. It was a bylaw violation, wasn't it?" "Article 9, Section 4, Karen snapped, turning her attention to him. "Unauthorized commercial vehicle in a community amenity zone. I was enforcing our covenants, which you, officer, have failed to do on multiple occasions." "Ma'am, with all due respect," Daniel said, rubbing his temples, "that's an Evac bus in the middle of a natural disaster. It's got a bit more leeway than a plumber's van." As Daniels attempted to get a statement from the bus driver and Miller tried to coordinate with his unit over his radio, a new player entered the arena. A beat-up, rust-colored Ford Ranger that looked like it had been assembled from the spare parts of a dozen other better trucks rattled up to the curb. "Bert's Fix It, Forget It" was spray-painted on the driver's side door. A man with a magnificent beer belly, a stained baseball cap, and a tool belt heavy with instruments of questionable purpose hopped out. He had the cheerful, predatory grin of a man who smelled money. He completely ignored the military presence and the police officer and made a beeline straight for me. "Hey there," he said, his voice a gravelly boom. "Bert the Gopher Higgins. Heard the chatter on the scanner. Looks like you got a classic Category 4 HOA apocalypse colliding with a genuine 5-alarm foobar. That, my friend, is my specialty." I stared at him. "Your specialty is this?" "Absolutely," he beamed. "Disaster mitigation, home fortification, spite construction, you name it. For a reasonable fee, I can make this house so fireproof and code compliant the fire itself will need to file a variance to get within 50 feet. I can install industrial-grade sprinklers, slap on some fire-retardant siding, clear your brush. I can also, he lowered his voice conspiratorially, dig you a moat. Very effective for keeping out unwanted solicitors." He winked, nodding his head toward Karen, who was now lecturing a young guardsman for leaning on a no loitering sign. I had to admit, the man had style. "I think I'm good, Bert. I'm just trying to get out of here like a normal person." "Normal went out the window the second she popped out that box cutter, son," Bert said sagely. He pressed a grimy business card into my hand. "Think about it. In a declared state of emergency, a lot of county ordinances and petty HOA rules get temporarily suspended. Public safety trumps aesthetic harmony every time. It's the perfect window of opportunity for unapproved home improvements." He gave me another conspiratorial wink and sauntered back to his truck, whistling. The situation devolved into a complete and utter stalemate. Skeet Miller couldn't abandon the stranded seniors. Officer Daniels was trying to figure out what, exactly, he could charge Karen with that would stick. Vandalism? Sure. But the paperwork would take hours, and that pillar of smoke on the horizon wasn't getting any smaller. Karen, for her part, had retreated to her front porch, where she was alternating between taking photos of the APCs for evidence and yelling corrections to Miller's radio protocol. I, through some cosmic joke, became the unwilling UN peacekeeper. Scrate. Miller, refusing to step onto Karen's property and give her the satisfaction, stood in my driveway and used me as his mouthpiece. "Private Thompson," he'd bark, forgetting my name was Alex. "It's Alex," I'd sigh. "Whatever. Get on your porch and tell that woman if she does not agree to be evacuated within 5 minutes, we are classifying her as a hostile civilian combatant." So I'd trudge up my own porch steps. "Karen!" I'd yell across the manicured lawns. "The sergeant says if you don't cooperate, he's going to, classify you as a non-compliant entity, and it's going to get all federal up in here." She'd scream back, "Tell that jackbooted thug that he doesn't have a signed Form 8C for vehicle staging in a residential cul-de-sac." I'd trudge back to Miller. "She says you need a Form 8C. Miller would just stare at me, his jaw muscles twitching. I could see him mentally calculating the length of the prison sentence for abandoning his post to go live in a cave in the mountains. This went on for nearly an hour. Me, a sarcastic web developer, relaying messages between a furious HOA president and a battle-hardened soldier, all while the world was preparing to burn down around us. It was, without a doubt, the most surreal and profoundly stupid day of my life. And it was about to get a whole lot stupider. The breaking point, when it came, wasn't a roar of fire or a military command. It was the quiet, insidious slither of a piece of paper. One of Karen's last acts before retreating into her beige fortress was to march across her lawn, up my walkway, and slide a folded piece of cream-colored stationery under my front door. It was an official HOA violation notice. Violation. Bylaw 217. G. Unauthorized congregation. Description: conferring with unauthorized paramilitary personnel in a public space in a manner that disrupts neighborhood tranquility and presents an intimidating visual tableau. Fine. 200. I stared at the paper. I read it again. Intimidating visual tableau? She was fining me for talking to the goddamn National Guard who were here to save us from a fiery death. A nerve deep inside my brain, a nerve that had been frayed and stretched thin by years of passive-aggressive welcome mats and clockwise coiled hoses, finally snapped with an audible twang. The world went from being a swirling vortex of chaos to a place of crystal-clear clarity. I looked at the violation notice in my hand. I looked at Karen's perfect, orderly house across the street. I looked at the thick, 3-ring binder on my bookshelf that contained the Whispering Pines covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And then I remembered Bert the Gopher's words, echoing like a prophecy from a grubby, tool-belted oracle. In a state of emergency, a lot of rules go out the window. A slow, wicked, and deeply satisfying grin spread across my face. My evacuation plan had just changed. I wasn't running anymore. I was renovating. I pulled Bert's card from my pocket. The number was smudged, but legible. I dialed. "Bert's Fix-It," the gravelly voice answered. "Bert," I said, my voice filled with a newfound sense of purpose. "It's Alex Thompson from the war zone. I've got a job for you. How familiar are you, exactly, with the Whispering Pines HOA bylaws?" There was a crackle of pure, unadulterated joy on the other end of the line. "Son," Bert said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "I know that cursed document better than the Bible. I'll be there in 5 minutes." True to his word, Bert's Ford Ranger came rattling back down the street, this time towing a flatbed trailer loaded with a chaotic assortment of ladders, scaffolding, paint cans, and mysterious-looking machinery. He was accompanied by 2 lanky young men who looked like they subsisted entirely on energy drinks and sarcasm. They were Bert's crew. "All right, boss," Bert said, rubbing his hands together as he surveyed my house. "Where do we start?" I held up the thick HOA binder. "We start here," I said, opening it to the first page. "This isn't a rulebook anymore. It's a to-do list." Our planning session was a thing of beauty, a rapid-fire symphony of spite. We sat on my porch, the approaching fire a distant but motivational roar, and plotted. "Okay," I said, tapping the page. Article 4. Section 2. All exterior paint colors must be chosen from the approved palette of muted earth tones. The palette includes such thrilling options as greige, taupe, sensible beige, and aggressively off-white. "Bert, what's the least muted, least earthy color you have in that truck?" Bert's eyes lit up. "My friend, have I got the color for you? It's a custom mix I use for marking industrial hazard zones. It's called Blinding Safety Orange. It's so bright, It gives the sun performance anxiety. Perfect, I crowed. We're painting the entire house blinding safety orange. What's next? Bylaw 15. A. Bert read over my shoulder. No lawn ornaments, sculptures, or non-botanical installations exceeding 18 inches in height without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I looked at the collection of pipes and nozzles on his trailer. That thing you mentioned earlier? The hydrodynamic thingy? The hydrodynamic fire suppression sculpture, Bert corrected proudly. Stands a solid 7 feet tall, looks like a giant angry metal cactus. Got a motion and heat sensor on it, plummet into your main water line, and anything that gets too hot or moves too fast in a 10-yard radius gets a high-pressure shower. We'll take it, I said, grinning like a madman. Mount it right on the peak of the roof. Let's see Karen measure that with her ruler. The project began. It was a glorious montage of malicious compliance. Bert's crew, fueled by my promise of hazard pay and all the lukewarm sodas they could drink from my non-evacuated fridge, swarmed the house. The sickeningly sensible beige of my exterior walls vanished under a coat of orange so vibrant it felt like a physical assault on the eyes. The sound of their paint sprayer was music to my ears. Next came the lawn. My perfect HOA-approved fescue, the source of so much anxiety and water consumption, was systematically murdered. They rolled it up like a cheap rug and replaced it with 2 tons of drab gray gravel. Around the foundation, they stacked sandbags, giving my suburban home the distinct look of a fortified checkpoint in a war-torn country. The pièce de résistance was the sprinkler. Bert and his guys wrestled the 7-foot metal monstrosity onto my roof and bolted it down right over the master bedroom. It was magnificent. It was hideous. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Of course, this activity did not go unnoticed. Karen, drawn by the sounds of her world being dismantled, emerged from her house. She stood on her property line, her face contorting in a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. I sauntered over to my new gravel patch, enjoying the crunch under my feet. "Fireproofing, Karen?" I shouted over the hum of the portable generator Bert had set up, a clear violation of Bylaw 88. B. The noise ordinance. It's all the rage this season. That color? She sputtered, pointing a trembling finger. It's an abomination. It's not on the approved palette. It's called Safety Orange, Karen, I yelled back cheerfully. It's designed to be highly visible to firefighting aircraft. Are you against pilot safety, Karen? Are you? Bert chimed in from the roof. It's also infused with photoluminescent particles that disrupt a fire's thermal signature. It's science, ma'am, he bellowed. I had no idea if that was true, but it sounded impressive as hell. And my lawn, she wailed. You're destroying the aesthetic integrity of this community. It's xeriscaping, Karen, I countered. Zero flammability landscaping. The fire marshal loves this stuff. You should try it. All the while, the National Guard contingent watched from their post down the street. At first, they were confused. But as the sheer, calculated audacity of my project became clear, their confusion melted into a kind of weary amusement. I saw Scott Miller talking on his radio, and while his face remained professionally stoic, I could see the corners of his mouth twitching. One of the younger soldiers, leaning against a Humvee, was trying very hard to look like he wasn't filming the whole thing on his phone. They had a real crisis to manage, but this little suburban psychodrama was clearly the best floor show in town. They didn't stop us. After all, everything we were doing, in its own twisted way, was making my house safer. We were breaking all of Karen's rules, and we were doing it in the name of public safety. It was the most beautiful loophole I had ever exploited in my entire life. The fun and games came to an end as the sky began to die. The hazy orange had deepened to a bruised, hellish red. The sun was gone, completely blotted out by a roiling ceiling of smoke. Ash, thick as winter snowflakes, began to drift down, coating everything in a soft, gray film. The distant roar of the fire was no longer distant. It was a constant, hungry growl that seemed to come from just over the next ridge. A sheriff's car, its lights flashing silently in the gloom, drove slowly down the street. A voice, distorted and urgent, blared from its loudspeaker. Final evacuation warning. Leave the area immediately. I repeat. This is your final warning. Emergency personnel will not be able to reach you beyond this point. This was it, The point of no return. SGT. Miller's brief period of amusement was over. His face was a grim professional mask. He had his orders. He marched toward Karen's house, his stride purposeful, with Officer Daniels flanking him. Two of his soldiers followed a few paces behind, their faces impassive. "Karen!" Miller's voice boomed, easily cutting through the apocalyptic ambience. "You have 60 seconds to get in this Humvee voluntarily. That is not a request. That is an order. We are leaving, and you are coming with us." Karen's front door flew open. She stood there, silhouetted against the light from her foyer, holding her phone up like a weapon. "I am recording this," she yelled, her voice tight with panic and defiance. "This is an assault on a private citizen. You have no jurisdiction over my private property. I will sue the United States government." As she was mid-rant, a flaming ember, the size of a fist, arced through the smoky air and landed with a soft thump on the asphalt shingles of my roof. It glowed there for a second, a malevolent orange eye in the twilight. I don't know what kind of cheap department store sensor Bert had installed in his magnificent creation, but it was apparently very, very effective. A low groan emanated from the peak of my roof. The giant metal cactus, my hydrodynamic fire suppression sculpture, my glorious monument to spite, whirred to life. With a sound like a giant clearing its throat, the main nozzle swiveled, aimed, and erupted. A massive, pulsating jet of water shot out, dousing the ember and a 10-foot section of my roof in an instant. But it didn't stop there. As promised by its creator, this was a wide coverage model. The nozzle began to rotate, spewing a powerful stream of water in a wide, sweeping arc. It soaked the new gravel lawn. It washed the ash off the street. And then, it found its primary target. Karen Swanson, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, phone held high, was hit full force by the torrent. The blast of water knocked her clean off her feet. Her phone went flying. She landed on her back in a splash, the water pinning her to the ground for a moment before the stream moved on. She sat up, sputtering, drenched, and utterly defeated. Her perfect blonde helmet of hair was plastered to her skull. Her beige capris were soaked through. Her clipboard, which had been lying near her feet, was caught in the newly formed river running down the gutter and began a gentle, final journey toward the storm drain. She just sat there on her lawn, in the falling ash and the eerie red glow, and began to sob. Not loud, angry sobs, but the quiet, broken sobs of a general whose army has been routed, whose fortress has fallen. The fight was gone. Seeing their window, the two soldiers moved in. They didn't grab her or restrain her. They simply walked up, offered her their hands, and helped her to her feet. She didn't resist. She let them guide her, a dripping, shuffling mess, to the open door of the waiting Humvee. She climbed in without a word. SGT. Miller watched her go, then turned and looked at me. I was standing on my porch, next to Bert, who had a grin on his face so wide it threatened to split his head in two. Miller didn't smile, but he gave me a single, slow, deliberate nod. A nod of understanding, a nod of respect. Then he turned, climbed into his own vehicle, and with a final roar of their engines, the convoy APCs and the Humvees, carrying the last dregs of Whispering Pines population, hunted away down the street. Their tracks a permanent, beautiful scar on the asphalt. Bert clapped me on the shoulder, his hand landing with a heavy thud. The cactus of justice on the roof continued its relentless, watery patrol over my absurdly orange house. "Told ya," Bert said, his voice filled with pride. Problem solved. I looked at my monstrous, glorious, fireproofed, and HOA-defying home, and for the first time in a very long time, I laughed. The fire, they said, was a monster. It burned for another week, consuming thousands of acres and coming so close to Whispering Pines that it singed the tops of the non-regulation height sycamores at the edge of the development. But a last-minute shift in the wind and the heroic work of the firefighters, who used my street as a staging area, saved our little pocket of suburbia. When we were finally allowed to return, it was to a neighborhood that smelled of smoke and pine and looked like it had a hangover. But it was there, and in the middle of it all stood my house. My bright, unapologetically orange house. It became something of a local landmark. People on their way to the newly reopened canyon would slow down their cars. Some would point. Some would take pictures. It was dubbed the Orange House on the Corner, the Spite House, the house that fought the HOA and won. The HOA, as it turned out, did not survive the fire. Karen, facing a hefty fine from the county for vandalism of an emergency vehicle and a civil suit from the bus company, had no fight left in her. An email went out a week after our return, announcing her resignation and immediate sale of her house. Rumor was she'd moved to a gated community in Arizona with a rulebook the size of a phone book, a place where she could finally be happy. Without its dragon, the organization crumbled. At a hastily called community meeting in the clubhouse, whose decorative paving stones were still scarred, the residents voted unanimously to dissolve the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. In its place, we formed the Neighborhood Watch and Occasional Barbecue Committee, a body with no power, no budget, and no bylaws. In a move that I'm still not sure wasn't a joke, I was unanimously elected its first chief of not caring about your mailbox color. My only duty was to organize a potluck twice a year. It's quiet now. I'm sitting on my front porch, which is still attached to my very orange house. I'd considered repainting it, but the color had grown on me. It was a statement. I did, however, take Bert up on a follow-up offer to tone it down to a slightly more respectable, burnt sienna. A compromise. Mrs. Gable's son-in-law had fixed my lawn not with fescue, but with a lovely mix of drought-tolerant native plants. My new wind chimes, a gift from Mrs. Gable herself, made from multicolored beer bottles, clinked merrily in the breeze. Their sound was almost certainly above the old 40-decibel limit. It was glorious. Officer Daniels drove by a moment ago, on his regular patrol. He slowed his cruiser, caught my eye, and gave me a slow, smiling thumbs up before continuing on his way. Chairman Meow was sunning himself on the gravel path, lord of all he surveyed. I took a sip of my coffee, the morning air crisp and clean. They say you can't fight City Hall, that you can't win against bureaucracy. And maybe that's true. But I learned that sometimes, when the world is literally on fire, all you need is a state of emergency, a profoundly opportunistic contractor, and 5 gallons of really, really ugly paint. Sometimes, that's enough to win the war. Or at least, enough to win back your own front porch.